Welcome to Perspectives in Mobile, the news podcast from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Join us discussing the world of telecommunications, technology, and mobile innovations. From Florence, Ricardo Amati.
Welcome to Math Podcast Perspectives, your source for the latest in mobile telecommunications and digitalization. We have a very special guest, Katie Harbath, Chief of Global Affairs Officer at Duco Expert, editor at the Anchor Change newsletter, and former Facebook Public Policy Director. Welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be discussing with Katie the impact of political mobile messaging on recent elections in various countries, the regulatory challenges it faces, and its potential influence on the upcoming US presidential election. We'll also explore the risks of foreign interference and the role of interference and the role of AI in election messaging. So stay tuned and you will get insights from one of the leading experts in the field. Katie, what are the major pros and cons of using mobile messaging for political campaigns?
Well, I think, mobile messaging overall has been used. There's a lot of different parts of mobile, right? There's not just text messaging, but there's obviously messaging apps, social media. The mobile phone is really a center point for most people in how they get their daily news and information, but also how they create content. And we really started seeing it used in campaigns and becoming very important in campaigns from about the 2012 election. So it's been quite some time that we've seen campaigns use this. And I think that one of the pros of it is that you can reach people throughout their day. It's one of the most intrusive ways. When you get a text message, when you get a notification on your phone, people pay attention to that. They will dive into that, and they're gonna want to take action. Some of the cons on that, though, is that the amount of content that you can put on a mobile message is less. You have people using far more number of apps and ways of getting information, so getting people's attention is also quite hard on some of these mobile devices. And also how people are using them continues to evolve, particularly video right now, and short form video is a really popular way that people are wanting to consume information. And that's not easy for everybody to create that type of content, particularly a political campaign. And so campaigns and candidates are constantly having to evolve how they think about how to best get out their messages using their own accounts on these apps, getting out to voters, but then also how they engage people like influencers and others that people are also paying attention to.
Right. And how did this field evolve? You were saying before 2012, it was nothing. Let's say until 10 years ago, it was really something that it didn't exist, or it existed just in a very, very few examples. How did it evolve?
Yeah, so I really first saw it. So when you think back, 2007 is when the iPhone was first introduced. The 2008 campaign of President Obama was the first that you really saw social media being used. I actually liken it. I know we're going to talk about AI later, but 2008 was the very early days of using social media for campaigning. I believe we're in that same kind of era now with AI. And then it was the 2010 midterms. Actually, I was working for the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And the difference between the beginning of 2010 and the end of 2010 and how much traffic we were getting to our website from mobile just exponentially increased. And so for me, that was a first indicator of the fact that mobile was going to start to be really important for campaigns. Then I mentioned Obama's 2012 race of really using data and digital and everything. And then by about 2015, you had, the iPhones or, phones that had screens and everything like we use today was really had pretty much hit mainstream across not just the United States, but across the world. And so then you started to see, again, more text messaging start to be used by campaigns. But then you also started to see more messaging apps like WhatsApp, particularly globally, being used by a lot more people in which to communicate. You saw messaging apps like Facebook Messenger And then, like I mentioned, video really started to become more popular, as well as podcasts. I think we should talk about that too, because a lot of people listen to podcasts when they're on the go and they do that via their phones. And a lot of that really started to come out, probably more, in the 2018, 2019-ish timeframe. 2020 was probably the first time that TikTok was really a prominent app, but this is even a bigger election year for an app like TikTok and how many people are using it. And so you can really kind of map out, you really need to map out the accessibility to these phones and having the internet access and the data access, along with the fact that campaigns are always going to go where voters are. And most voters always have a phone on them now.
Of course. And what about 2024? Some sources, for example, Rumble app, the company, told us that they expect 25 billion political messages from here to November for the US presidential election. Paradoxically, in Italy, we just had elections, local administrative election. I'm in Italy, that's why I'm giving you this example. I'm in Italy at the moment.
Yeah.
And we had the EU elections. And political messaging wasn't really, it was utilized, but not so much. So there are many differences between different countries. Just taking into account 2024, which is the elections year really. Everywhere there are elections. We have seen election in India, in the UK, in France, the EU Parliament. What differences do you see in the different areas of the world, and why there are so many differences?
Yeah,
do they follow the way that people use mobile phones, or are there other reasons?
So there's a couple of things to think about when we think about the differences kind of around the world. I think the first thing that I always tell people is that the way that elections are run in the United States are the exception versus the rule globally. There's so many different things about the United States, from the amount of money that is involved to how long our elections go. I mean, you were mentioning, like, in Europe, most countries have elections over a 6-week time period. I mean, France was even shorter with their snap.
France did it in a couple of weeks. Really.
They did it in a couple of weeks. In the U.S., we're kind of in a constant state of campaigning, right? Like, yes, our elections are technically every 2 years, but it's also one of the only countries that you really have this professional political class of consultants and vendors and everyone else that are also playing a role in it. The other difference, I think, with our campaigns versus others is we do have a central election commission in the Federal Election Commission, but they really only regulate money in the campaign, in the political world. You also have all these state election officials, and the elections are actually run at a very local level in a very decentralized way. So when you're looking at, then you also need to look at around the world, internet access is different. What people have access to and how families even utilize cell phones in places like India or some countries in Africa or even anywhere in the global south, really. Many times a family might be sharing one phone and you have multiple people on it. They might be walking to a village in order to get internet access. They don't have as readily available access as other people do. You also have different regulations and different sort of cultural norms. So in Europe in particular, data access and collecting people's personal information, including phone numbers, is something that's highly regulated and just not as, and there's so many more rules around it in Europe than there are in America. All the time I get European campaigns that come to America or call me up and they're sort of like, tell us how we can do campaigns like you do in America. And I'm like, I start to tell them all about data collection and modeling and all that. They're like, oh no, we can't do that. We can't, so it's very hard.
The sensitivity is different, isn't it?
It is.
Probably.
And that's okay, right? It just means that how campaigns are approached is different and there's a lot of similarities, but how these are approached in different countries and different regions of the world are really important to look at. And I also mentioned too, again, the types of apps that they use. So WhatsApp has been very interesting to watch because that is an app that was used around the world way more than the United States. In many campaigns, 2019, there were a lot of elections that year that I was a part of globally where WhatsApp was a really central part of how people were communicating. And now we're starting to see WhatsApp rise in the United States as well. And so that's an interesting sort of lagging indicator, which is usually sometimes the U.S. is at the forefront of it. I think I would say, too, in the United States that I think is worth talking about when we talk about mobile messaging is that, for a decade plus, campaigns have really used email. I mean, 2004, I was sending out emails for fundraising and stuff like that at the Republican National Committee. Email fundraising has really dropped off in the last year or two for campaigns in the United States. There's a lot of theories as to why. It could be that people are just overwhelmed. They're getting too much email. They're getting sick and tired of it. The economy being what it is, they don't have as much disposable income to give to these campaigns. And so what you are seeing, and you said you got those numbers from Rumble about the number of messages, you are seeing campaigns start to try to use text messaging even more so than what they have done in the past. And it's frankly starting to get quite annoying for people. I suspect that in the coming years, we might start to see some regulation or rules in the United States about how much that there's already technically rules around it, but people find ways to get around them to send these mass text messages. But campaigns right now are trying to squeeze whatever juice they can out of every method that they have of reaching to voters and trying to get money, because it's just getting much, much harder to do.
What are the main regulatory challenges, in your opinion?
Well, I think that, there's a lot of them, right? But I think I can boil it down right now to one, some of the regulatory challenges are now, how are some of these new regulations, such as the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act in Europe, the Online Safety Bill in the UK, how are these going to be enforced? What is going to be determined to be in scope or out of scope? What's going to be okay or not okay? I talk to a lot of clients for my work who are just like, I really just want a list of what I can do and can't do. And it's like, well, the law's not written in that specific of a way. And then you add AI on top of that. And it's like, does it apply? Does it not apply, et cetera? And then you also have regulations in some part of the world that are quite problematic. Countries that have, under the guise of fighting fake news, are using laws to actually suppress opposition voices, to harass employees of companies if they don't take down content. We saw this in India with the Modi administration putting pressure on platforms like X to take down content that was critical of them. So there's a lot of questions for companies about when do they push back on regulation and when they don't. And then in places like the United States, you have, at the federal level, we've not seen comprehensive regulation, whether it's privacy, child safety, election, stuff like that. We have seen stuff at the state level. But again, a lot of this is being challenged in the courts now. And so we had some really big Supreme Court decisions come down in recent weeks talking about companies' First Amendment right to moderate content on their platform, whether or not how much they can engage with governments, especially looking at foreign interference. And while the courts gave a little bit of clarity, there's still a long way to go. And another one that continues to loom here in the United States is whether or not TikTok will be able to be banned. That's probably the only piece of regulation that Congress has passed and the president has signed, but it is immediately being challenged in court. And so I think we have a long way to go before we see if that will get banned or not.
Multilateralism is a bit out of fashion, but do you think in the future some kind of multilateral agreements about rules, about political messaging and many other things regarding the digitalization, the change in management change and all these things, do you think that would be possible and that would be a good thing, or maybe every country has to be their regulation?
There's a big fear amongst a lot of people about the fragmentation of the internet globally, because we are trying to different countries are trying to regulate a technology that has no borders, which is really challenging. And you are seeing some multilateral agreements and stuff, but those things take a long time, and technology moves so quickly. And I think a big thing right now that everyone is watching is who wins in November. I think that a Trump administration who tends to be much more not as in favor of doing multilateral agreements and working internationally will have a much different approach to this than a Biden or another Democratic administration will on this. So, NATO is happening or just recently happened in DC. That's been a big part. Some technology and discussions and stuff have been happening there. But all the sense that I really get is this collective holding of the breath of where America will go and how that will impact the next 4 years, which is a really crucial 4 years with AI and how fast AI is being deployed out there, of what that will mean for any potential global agreements. The other thing I want to mention too as part of this, forgive me if I'm going too far down a rabbit hole, is we also have a bunch of questions around how the internet is governed globally that are coming up for discussion here at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, where right now it's been a very collaborative approach across government, civil society, many others. And there's a lot of governments, particularly China, who want more power being put into governments about how the internet globally is regulated. So how domains are allocated, like the entire stack of the internet, that I don't feel is being talked about enough, because depending upon where those agreements go and what that looks like could cause some really fundamental changes for how the internet works all around the globe.
Foreign interference. How might foreign powers try to challenge the U.S. election? I mean, we've seen what happened in the last ones, and Russia was alleged as interference in the election. And now we have more sophisticated technology. We have AI in particular. What do you expect there? Some kind of new kind of attacks? Are you worried about this?
I am. We're definitely seeing, and we've seen companies share, not just from Russia, but China, Iran are some of the main ones that we definitely see interference on. And I think that, particularly when elections are close, when there's a lot of discontent already happening on the domestic scene, you will see foreign adversaries trying to pile onto that and try to stoke a lot of those divisions. And I think that's an important thing when we talk about sort of foreign interference or just interference overall in elections, is that it's actually starting to get harder of separating out what's foreign versus domestic, because foreign adversaries are getting much better at sort of, again, jumping on to things that are already happening in a country, trying to boost it, maybe make them go more viral, get more attention, whatever that might be, and then getting local actors, people, spreading it, which is what the definition of misinformation is. And so it's actually getting a lot more challenging for companies in order to try to find these types of interference, these types of efforts by foreign ones. They do continue to do so and take them down. We are also seeing, though, too, is that a lot of foreign interference, and we saw this a lot with the Israel-Palestinian war when that broke out in October, is that a lot of foreign interference and bad actors who kind of want to just sow distrust on the internet, they're not focusing on the bigger platforms who have built up teams and processes and stuff for dealing with this. They're really starting to go to either platforms that don't have as much content moderation in teams like Telegram and X and stuff like that, but then also other platforms like Discord and Twitch and others that are just newer and still trying to build up those efforts. And so you are seeing these efforts going across a lot more of smaller platforms. It can be much harder to find them. And you're also needing a bit more of, companies working together a lot more to be able to share signals and stuff like that, as well as working with the government. And the government can get signals sometimes the companies can't. And that was a big part of the Supreme Court decision around Murphy v. Missouri about whether or not about whether or not companies and governments could continue to do that. That's still a bit murky. I think we will see some signal sharing, but that's something that I think is worrisome as we go into this election, on the potentials that we might miss something.
Right. What role is AI currently playing in the political mobile messaging, both positive and negative? Because, of course, when we are talking about interferences with AI, they are going to be more powerful probably than some years ago. But still, AI it can be a way of defending proper messaging as well, isn't it? So what's, again, pros and cons of AI in the political messaging?
Yeah, I think that, I think it's important, and I'm really glad that you framed it as that there's both pros and cons in terms of AI and political messaging and stuff like that. We have seen AI used in some nefarious ways. There was the Biden robocall in New Hampshire that made it sound like it was President Biden. We've seen in India where they've brought back to life dead politicians to, support and endorse some of the candidates that are happening there. But we've also seen positive uses. In Indonesia, campaigns were creating chatbots, and they were using it to create more cartoon figures of them. Some people didn't like that, but it wasn't necessarily nefarious. In Pakistan, you saw Amir Khan after their election. This is a man who's been jailed. He has no other way of getting his messaging out. They've tried to silence him, and they were able to use AI for him to be able to speak to his supporters. He labeled it as such. He said it was authorized. And so and then you're also seeing campaigns using it to try to, help them it can really help smaller campaigns that don't have a ton of resources to be able to write a bunch of social media posts, to help write their emails, to help summarize different things. I think that, again, this is very early days of these tools and these technologies. Now, a lot of the platforms, these AI platforms, are not allowing political use of their tools while they try to figure out what the right guardrails should actually be. And so you're also starting to see some vendors and others that are starting to build their own models and tools. So again, I think that we'll actually see more AI being used in the campaigns in future years than the next 5 years of campaigns. And I think, when it comes to mobile messaging, you're also seeing people being able to use it to translate things into different languages they might not speak. They're able to get information to people and speak to them in the languages and dialects that they might better understand. And again, this is all kind of, the wild, wild west with very little rules and stuff around it. And so we're kind of trying to figure out these ethical guardrails as we go, but you're definitely starting to see people experiment with it.
You already gave very, very interesting examples, but can you give us an examples that you like of innovative use of political messaging in the last year? And what strategy do you see as prominent in the November U.S. presidential elections? So 2 questions in one.
Yeah. Well, I think, two novel uses, and it's not necessarily specifically to AI, if I'm honest. Like, I've seen there's some interesting uses of AI, but there hasn't been anything yet where I'm like, wow, that's something that's like really different and innovative. I think we're, again, it's still early days of kind of looking at that. I do think an interesting thing that I'm watching as part of this, and then I'll get into actually the 2 campaigning things, is also how platforms are starting to respond to this, and you're starting to see AI summaries of things when you go to like Facebook comments and stuff like that. I'm very curious to see how that changes the incentives for people who create content like politicians about what they actually post and where they post it, et cetera. Kind of also looking at how Gen Z really utilizes some of these platforms, like TikTok, and a video, again, is really popular amongst them, which brings me to some of the innovative 2 things that I think are worth people watching, that is worth for people to watch. One is the continued engagement of influencers. I was just reading a story today about how at NATO, again, the summit, they had a bunch of influencers that they invited across TikTok and Instagram and other places in which to report. The Biden campaign's been doing that. They had them at the New York fundraiser they had a couple of months ago. They're going to be at the conventions. The Republicans have been doing the same thing, particularly on TikTok, where there's a bit of a political quandary for campaigns there because of the ban that has been voted on is working through the courts. Like I mentioned, a lot of campaigns and politicians don't want to be on TikTok, but they know it's where the voters are. They know it's where young voters are. And so they are, again, utilizing influencers and others to try to get their messages out, because only really like Biden and Trump have there's others, but those are the two main ones that have TikTok accounts. So influencers is one. The other thing that I don't think we're paying enough attention to is the use of podcasts. You are seeing a lot of candidates go on podcasts to talk to voters. Biden went on the very popular podcast Smartless. Trump just recently went on the very popular podcast All In, which is with 3 or 4, I can't remember, really prominent people, men in Silicon Valley. Those are 3-hour interviews. That is a long time for a candidate and a lot of time for them to be taking. But podcasts, again, are increasingly becoming a way for them. They might get friendlier questions. They can maybe control the messaging a little bit better. And they know that that's a place that people are listening, and they're quite popular. Joe Rogan's another one. And so I don't think we really pay enough attention to that, about where these candidates are trying to go and find these pockets of support in which to try to get some of their messaging out. And again, a lot of that's all delivered via mobile.
Last question. What advice would you give to policymakers and tech companies to ensure, an ethically and effectively positive use of political messaging in elections, if you have any recipe?
This is the question that has been on my mind, and I continue to work on, of trying to think about, I hit 20 years of working at the intersection of tech and politics. I came into all of this in 2003. I moved to Washington, D.C. Facebook didn't exist yet. YouTube didn't exist yet. Twitter didn't. It was really just websites and email at that point in time. And I've really seen a lot of, obviously, evolution over the last 20 years. And I really do think that we can get to a place where we can continue to mitigate the bad and amplify the good, because I do think the internet and mobile and everything has brought a lot of really positive things to political campaigning and engaging with voters and helping them to better understand what is happening in the system. And so I think what I would recommend is, twofold. Is one, we need to continue to make sure there's transparency, not just on the platform side of what they are doing and the decisions they're making, but on the government side and how they're trying to engage with platforms and what they're talking to platforms about. And then I think we need to continue to look at, how do we build in systems of checks and balances? Because nobody wants the platforms fully in charge. Nobody wants the governments fully in charge. Nobody wants any single entity fully in charge of what all of this looks like. And so instead, we need to find ways to make sure that we're holding each other accountable as the technology continues to rapidly evolve faster and faster and faster. It's only going to get more quick. And so we've got to learn how to really continue to move quickly and kind of think about, how do we provide frameworks that maybe aren't so specific that they get out of date super quickly, but really give people that way of trying to figure out those ethical guardrails. So I don't have all the answers right now, but it's something that I continue to work on, because like I like to say, platforms can run, but they can't hide from politics. And so it's going to always continue to be an issue and something we're going to have to figure out.
Check and balances. This is, at the end of the day, the same thing that we need for many things regarding politics if we want democracy. So, courtesy of Katie, we covered a broad range of topics about the impact and challenges of political mobile messaging in elections. Thank you, Katie. Katie Harbath, SGAO, is that the correct acronym? At Duco
Yes.
Experts and Anchor Change CEO. That's all. Thank you very much, Katie, for being with us. That's all for this episode of Perspective, the math podcast where experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see, and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, and innovative mobile services. Thank you again to Katie Harbath. Stay tuned. From Riccardo Matti, goodbye and good luck with your work.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives in Mobile. Join us next as we explore telecoms, technology, and mobile innovations. Stay tuned, stay connected, and let's unlock the mobile potential together.